BMAC, let's keep it in the NFL for a legit or nah. NFL Network is in the process of unveiling its top 100 players this summer, and Cardinals running back David Johnson checked in at number 12 this week. There are two running backs, Le'Veon Bell and Ezekiel Elliott, in this year's top 10. You see there, Johnson is second in yards from scrimmage since he entered the league. Is Johnson the most underrated NFL player right now?
I think so. I think clearly he's the most underrated offensive player. He's a star. And for David Johnson to not be inside the top 10, when you look at the network having 10 spots for running backs, and neither one of these guys, they're named David Johnson, that's absurd. I mean, this is a guy that had, out of 16 ball games, he had 15 games where he had at least 100 yards from scrimmage. That's production. That's consistency. And you look at this offense a year ago, when they started to plummet in the wrong direction, he was the only bright spot. He was the one guy you had to stop, number 31. And you look at the fantasy implications. This is a guy that won a lot of fantasy owners their leagues because he was so consistent. I hated to play against David Johnson because I knew there was a chance he would score at least 18 points, 18 fantasy points in any league. That's impressive. And for him to be outside of the top 10, yes, he's underrated. And I think a lot of that has to do with the market he's playing in. And not to mention the Arizona Cardinals, they were a big letdown as a team. They were not as good as many expected them to be, but yet and still as an individual, he balled out. And Ezekiel Elliott is in the top 10. Yeah. Le'Veon Bell is in the top 10. I have no gripes with Le'Veon Bell being in the top 10. But Ezekiel Elliott, that's a guy I think should have been number 12 and find a way to get David Johnson in the top 10. Look at these numbers. Now, granted, Ezekiel Elliott has more rush yards. But the thing about David Johnson, and when you compare David Johnson to a guy like Le'Veon Bell, it's the total production. He almost had 1,000 yards catching the football. That's impressive.
Yeah, BMAC, I know you mentioned maybe it's the market that he's in, but is there anything about his game that might keep him out of that top 10? Why you don't see him up there?
He's a quiet guy. I mean, he has the demeanor of a Tim Duncan type. You know, he's very, very humble. He don't talk a lot. He allow his game to speak for himself, but then it's the market. You look at Ezekiel Elliott, he plays for America's team. They're one of the best teams in the league. So many of his games were on a primetime stage, and so many casual fans got an opportunity to watch Ezekiel Elliott. But David Johnson, if you had a fantasy opportunity of drafting Ezekiel Elliott and David Johnson, based on what we saw a year ago, who would you go with? Probably David Johnson.
Yeah, BMAC, we'll see what happens in this next season if maybe he can go from the underrated player to now being this player that everyone's like, wow, yes, that guy definitely was underrated.